This is, amazingly, our 8th Shenkman lecture. And over the course of the last 8 years, we have seen the event grow to encompass not only the lecture, but a variety of open studio experiences for the general public. I sincerely hope you've had the opportunity to go through the MFA studios, as well as seeing the undergraduate specialized studio and drawing shows that are in Alexander Hall. If not, the studios will remain open after the lecture this evening until after 9 o'clock for your viewing pleasure. So I hope everyone will get a chance to be able to see our outstanding students. Today is a celebration of the University of Guelph as one of Canada's preeminent studio art programs. As a school, we are rightfully proud of our rigorous curriculum, our excellent faculty, our passionate students, and our very loyal alumni. And we are also very aware that our good fortune is due, in large measure, to those in the community who continue to share our dream of creating a truly international class program in the visual arts. It is a lofty goal, but as the quality of our students' work and the reputation of our alumni attest, it is well within our reach. I would like specifically this evening to take the opportunity to thank a number of you from the art community for your ongoing support of our school, our programs, and our students. To the many gallerists, curators, art dealers, critics, collectors, museum directors, who each year take the time out of your busy schedules to visit our studios and support our MFAs in this really important time in their career, please know that you're making a huge difference in their lives and the lives of all of our students. I would also like to take a minute to thank a few people without whom this wonderful event would not be. To this year's organizing committee of Vicky Isotam, Sandra Sabatini, and Jen Lorette from the College of Arts, to Dean Donald Bruce, who's been instrumental in supporting recent school initiatives, and to Professors Sandra Rechico, James Carl, and Robert Enright, all of whom have been instrumental in various ways in the design of this event, I would like to offer my deepest and sincerest thanks. And as turnaround is fair play, I would also like to take this opportunity to publicly thank President Alistair Summerlee on this, his last Shenkman lecture as president of the University of Guelph, for his unwavering support of the fine arts on this campus and his commitment to the cultural life of this city. Alistair, you have attended every single Shenkman lecture, and your presence and leadership has meant a great deal to all of us. On behalf of the school, I would like to publicly wish you and your family the very best as you shortly begin the next stage of your life. To Professors Margaret Priest and Tony Sherman, I would like to express the school's continued gratitude for your generosity and your extraordinary loyalty to our program. Your steadfast belief in us, our young artists, and the enormous potential of the school is very much appreciated. And last but not least, on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students, I would like to acknowledge the generosity and vision of Dasha Shenkman, who has, with her generous gift and ongoing support, made these lectures possible. Dasha, your support of the school and your commitment to the education of these exceptional young people is an inspiration. Thank you for this wonderful gift to this community. Thank you. And now, without any further ado, please welcome Research Professor Robert Enright, who will introduce this, our 8th Shenkman Lecturer in Contemporary Art.
Good evening. In her review of the East Aganskin retrospective that closed just 10 days ago at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Roberta Smith called the 40-year survey grand, sometimes grating, and a disturbance in the force of the New York art world. We're all familiar with the idea that criticism is really a form of autobiography. And using that measure, I can safely say that Roberta's assessment of the Genskin show is equally a description of the nature and effect of the 40-plus years that she's been writing about art in the same New York world that Genskin has so thoroughly vexed. It's a disturbance we readers have been lucky to encounter. I know of no critic who has set her omnivorous gaze on the objects and events that make up contemporary art and has produced from that intimate looking such consistently clear, intelligent, and admirable writing. For straightforwardness, she is without peers. She's also peerless in the range of things she engages, from the depiction of Islamic carpets in the golden age of Dutch painting, to the retelling of the story of photography from the collection of MoMA, from the monstrous productions of Paul McCarthy and Jeff Koons, to an exhibition of 33 intimate Renaissance and Baroque bronzes at the Frick. She is all eyes. She said she learned about art history by writing about everything. So when I say she's omnivorous in her looking, I mean that both as a measure of the range of things she looks at and in the specific way she looks at them. Having looked once, she will look again. So her assessment of a recent exhibition of Gauguin's work at the Modern is that it's a sea change. This show creeps in on the little cat feet of often dark, subtly textured works on paper, she writes. Criticism as stealth, as a paw print, as a measure. The simplicity and directness of her observations is often startling. Of a bronze by Antonio Cecchini in the Frick exhibition I mentioned, depicting one of Hercules' labors in dispatching a centaur, she writes, "Their entwined figures form one of the most heated sculptural moments in a New York museum. You couldn't see or write better about what that sculpture does than she does." There's one more thing about her writing that I need to comment on, and it touches her sense of how we experience art. She constantly makes reference to the way that the art she's looking at sits in space. What I mean is she's a curator's and an installer's best friend or worst enemy. She looks at how what she's looking at occupies the space of a room. In a review of David Smith's Forgings, a body of 10 totemic monoliths made in 1955 and exhibited a year later at the Willard Gallery, she comments that the installation in a narrow gallery may not be as stunning as they were in the Guggenheim's centenary retrospective, but this more modest arrangement, she remarks, encourages close looking at the variety of silhouettes, surface technique and association, and illuminates Smith's working and thinking processes. In an important way, she replicates through her own medium of language Jasper John's famous methodology. Look at an object, write something about it, write something else about it. Please join me in welcoming the art critic who's written more something else's about almost everyone over more than 4 decades of close observation, Roberta Smith.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was a little hard to listen to, but anyway, I appreciate it. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm really honored, and I've had a great time. I got here yesterday afternoon and went immediately to the David Mirvish collection and had total immersion in color field painting, including Mr. Mirvish's I guess audio, one would say. It was fantastic. And then I went to a wonderful dinner last night that was partially, I guess, in my honor, but really seemed to be a bunch of people who, most of whom knew some and liked most of everyone else who wanted to get together every year. And now I'm here as the 8th Shenkman lecturer, and already an impressive tradition that I hope I'll be able to maintain. I'll do my best. I don't give lectures, I'll say that first of all. I think of these as a kind of chat without the fireside. And I basically will sort of talk to you about what I do and how I came to do it. And a chat for me is the best way to get to a good question and answer period. So that's going to be the best part. If you know the story of stone soup, that's sort of what my lectures are like. You actually get to bring it. And so if I don't have a good question and answer period, it's devastating. It's really, really bad. So just bear that in mind. And, I will just talk. It may not be totally connected, but it'll all be around a certain have a certain focus, and then it will kind of dwindle, and then maybe somebody will ask me some questions and I'll remember something else I haven't said. So this is how it's going to proceed. I usually start by saying I've been writing criticism, as Robert said, for over 40 years. I published my first writing in 1972 in Arts Magazine, and I feel incredibly lucky and incredibly blessed that I've been able to do it and keep doing it for so long. A lot of people think that critics are necessary evils, and some people think they're not even necessary. You know, it's a cliche, but let's talk about it a little. You know that we are all critics, and in many different ways. We're all certainly critics of everyday life. When we get up in the morning, how we dress, how we eat, how our house is set up, all of these decisions are, in some measure, even though I'm biased, in some measure aesthetic choices, where you're looking at the options, you're kind of consciously or unconsciously analyzing the degree of pleasure you get from one option versus another, and you're making a kind of judgment or choice based on that. Secondly, you're all critics of popular culture. You're very relaxed about this. You know when you like a piece of music, when you want to spend time with it. You know when a joke is funny and when it's not. You have a reaction. You know when you're looking at a good television commercial. You know, this is an American example, I hope it will work here. You know that there's even progress in popular culture. You know, for example, that arrested development is progress beyond, say, Cheers or Friends. You have an experience of that. So when you get in front of artworks, often, I wouldn't expect it to be that often with this crowd, but for a lot of people there's a kind of shutdown, a kind of cutoff, where you're intimidated by what you're looking at, and your mind kind of takes over. The point is that what I do is that I've just learned how to make my mind shut up and learn how to listen to myself. And that's what everybody who's involved with art is in the process of doing. And if you're lucky, you'll figure out a way to spend your life doing that, because there's more art in the world than you can ever know. And here I'm going to break away and make a little comment, okay? This is for the students, and I don't mean to upset you or shock you, but I will say this. If you have art in your life, if you already know that you love art and you cannot live without it, you have to follow that love wherever it will take you. And I will tell some of you that it may take you away from being an artist. Okay? Just because you're getting an MFA here does not mean you're going to be an artist. Only be an artist if you cannot possibly be anything else. If you can be anything else, be it. I guarantee you that your MFA will be put to wonderful use. It isn't wasted. And you probably will be involved with art in some way. But there's nothing worse than ignoring when art is beckoning you away from being an artist and you ignore it. That can make your life very miserable. And now, see, I lost my train of thought. I have friends like that. I have somebody who I think is kind of I know someone who's kind of a natural-born dealer, but he's persisted in being an artist, and he's quite isolated and feels very insecure about his work, and he hasn't had the success he wanted. And you just have to, you can't have these kinds of hierarchies. If you have art, that's the main thing. How it will be in your life, you let it decide. The greatest thing and the reason that you want to be happy is not just because you're going to be happy, but because it will enable you to give back. And because if you have art, which a lot of people consider frivolous and non-essential, we can talk about that later, but if you have that kind of luck, you have a kind of obligation to give back. It's essential to you. Show other people, put a few other people in touch with how it's essential to them, help them find it. So it's not just for your own happiness that I ask you to listen to where your art takes you. I'm married to a former artist who's now an art critic. And it's always part of you. It won't ever go away. It's part of something special, but I'm just saying, just listen. So we have pauses like this. So we're all critics, and up to a point, until something happens, I was talking in an interview about this afternoon, until something happens that breaks through, we kind of had experience art from the neck up. And then you have some intense memory that alerts you to how things are visually, and that visual things, they exist in the world differently. And then you're opened up to art in some way. Basically, we're all born with a kind of aesthetic instrument. And it's a full-bodied thing. You experience art with your whole body, which is why the neck cutoff doesn't really work. And I think I've sort of said this already, but what you'd have to do is learn to shut yourself up and listen to what's coming. Whatever is coming up for you is something to use. If it's a childhood memory, if it's a visual memory, no matter what it is, it's a piece of evidence of things going on in you, and you have to follow it. That's really all I do when I'm writing criticism. The more you look, the longer you live, the more you'll have that will come up, and that's when things start getting very, very interesting. I became a critic in a roundabout way. When I was coming up, it wasn't something you can measure, you could major in school or get a degree in. I think criticism isn't something that most people set out to be. It's certainly not like being an artist. But I'm circling again. To be an artist is the most kind of broad, most romantic, most visible profile, the form that your first love of art can take. And that's why, and then you start to refine it. I think the greatest thing that I learned when I first came to New York was the understanding that the New York art world artists were in the minority. That most people, some of whom had come there to be artists, most people had to be around art. And they stopped being artists, or they arrived there like I did, not quite knowing what I would do. But they found a way to do something that they could call work, that would make them a kind of living, and that would enable them to be around art. I had grown up in an academic situation, and I'd never really done very well in school, so I, of course, was thrilled, like, hey, there's no structure in this place. You know, it's all kind of, people have talent, they rise. You know, it's in constant motion, but there are not that many people that are like associate professors or deans or, you know, this kind of hierarchy that I was used to. And that was a big idea to me. I'd like to say that I began to be a critic because I had a critical mother, so what else is new? But my mother, I was an only daughter, and my mother who I think was a kind of frustrated, I don't know what, she wanted to work in a museum or something, but she decorated her house a lot, and I was constantly pressed into service as a kind of sounding board. And I learned early on that opinions were valuable, that it was something, you had opinions and people talked to you about your opinions. My mother always took them very seriously. So I did kind of grow up with this idea about having reactions to things. You know, those things happen to be like fabric swatches and paint chips, but furniture and ceramics got in there too. And then I think my first really intense aesthetic reaction was being in a Mercedes that belonged to my aunt. And this was just a kind of lesson that some things are better than others, you know, and that you can distinguish them. And that our 1953 Plymouth station wagon was not a Mercedes, you know, but it was like a kind of awe, like this, oh yeah. And the other thing with growing up in the Midwest was just the landscape, and just certain points of the landscape that I realized that I really loved. The other thing that got me to be an artist was, to be a critic, was that I did manage, without really thinking about it, to get to New York. I went to Grinnell College. I was told that the year I got in, they accepted everyone. That was heartening. And, but I had a college professor who was a New Yorker manqué, who knew everything that was going on in New York. And he found out about this thing called the Whitney Independent Study Program when it was in its second semester, and he just sort of picked me up by the scruff of the neck and said, "You are applying to this." And I was stunned and terrified. And I actually managed to get in, and I went, and the main thing you did for your application was to propose a paper. And for some reason, I knew about Donald Judd. I think I had seen it on the Sunday Times that my parents took or something. And so I proposed Donald Judd and a paper on minimalism. And I got there, and I went to see Judd, and he said, "I'm totally uninterested in minimalism." So I went away, and I came back and I said, "Okay, what about a paper on you?" So I did a paper on his development from 2 to 3 dimensions. Being around Judd was like a living Mercedes, just in terms of my own experience. He was someone who was completely visually oriented, and who never let anything into his immediate environment that hadn't passed certain kinds of tests of quality. And so that everything was, in the word that he so famously used, highly specific. You know, the glasses were Baccarat crystal, the table was a kind of probably arts and crafts oak, the pans, I forget the name of the pans, but I went out and bought them. You know, the china was Arabia. I don't even know if anybody remembers that anymore. It's Finnish, and it was extremely plain. Anyway, Judd was a huge influence, and he had written criticism. And at a certain point, I wrote my paper, I got out of college, I came back to New York, I got a job as a secretary at the Museum of Modern Art, even though I could barely type, much less, hardly error-free. And I decided that I wanted to sort of be useful to Judd. So I said, he had written criticism from 1959 to 1964 for Arts magazine. He had been a great critic for that period. And I said to him, "Wouldn't it be interesting if all your writing were in one place?" And he said, "Yes." Surprise. So I would take all these copies of Arts magazine, I'd take them home, and I would type them. And by the time I was done, I had a 150-page single-space manuscript, and I had completely absorbed Judd's worldview and his very laconic, very compressed style of writing. And the next thing that happened was that Robert Pink Swinton, do you remember him? He's the man who coined the term post-minimalism. He wrote an article on Judd for Artforum, which offended me beyond words. I had no idea how kind of territorial I was about this subject. So I started writing a letter, and I wrote a 10-page letter. The curator I worked for said, "You know, you could be an art critic." And I had never even thought of that. And she said, "You know, I'll send this in with a covering letter." And she did, and she went on a trip, and she got back. She got a letter back from the editor of Artforum, who was Legion, and who is Legend, and whose name is Phil Leader. Name doesn't escape me. The letter said, "This is an obnoxious way for anyone who wants to be an art critic to get started. But if she cuts it in half, we'll run it. So that was basically how the idea came to me. It was like being hit over the head twice. And I decided that I really wanted to try to do this, that I really had loved reading and rewriting Judd's writings. And, I loved Pauline Kael, I loved Edmund Wilson, all these people. And I set out 3 goals for myself. I wanted to be published by the time I was 25. Consequently, I went to the least threatening of the art magazines and managed it. I wanted to do this for my life as a primary activity. Criticism was seen as a secondary activity by almost everyone. It was something that anyone could do, and a lot of people really did it well as a kind of sideline, Judd being an example. But artists could write criticism, people who were working on their novels could write criticism, or their PhDs wherever. Peter Sheldall was a poet, one of many poets who wrote criticism. And I just thought, I want to do this as a primary thing. I want to do it for my life. I want to make my living doing only this. And I want to stay open enough to avoid this kind of hardening of the arteries that I think most critics get, where they cannot get beyond the first generation that they come into the art world with. It happened to Rosenberg, it happened to less extent to Greenberg, it happened to Judd, as far as I'm concerned. And I just wanted to try to do it. And at this point, I've done it for 42 years. I could quit, but I can't quit, because it's actually all I do. And, luckily my husband's a critic, or I don't know where I would be, actually. So I started writing for art magazines, and in about 2 years I wanted to kill myself, because it took so long to write, it was excruciating to be edited, and then by the time you were in print, the show was so long gone, nobody was thinking about it. And a friend of mine said, well, if you really want to do this for life, you have to get an audience, and if you want an audience, you have to get outside the art world. So I went to the Village Voice and sort of got my foot in the door. I was sort of like the 3rd or the 4th tier art critic. And that was a revelation. You have these moments in your life of total terror, and your work changes without your having to think about it much. And going from the art world to the Voice was one of those moments. But what really had happened that was so electrifying was that my writing was in print while the art I was writing about was on view. And this was essential. Criticism is basically a journalistic activity. It's done in real time. You don't have the benefit of hindsight when you're looking at things. You don't have the benefit of much time when you're meeting deadlines. But being in print while the art was on view, I realized was this real test. People were going to take my work, they were going to go look at the art, and they were going to know exactly how useful it was. And that was terrifying. And that just shook so much kind of BS out of me. I realized I couldn't think about what Judd thought. There was all this white noise that was suddenly gone, and you're just sort of left with you and the reader. It was a lot like going from, if you can imagine, a rock band that only records in the studio to being a rock band that only performs live on stage. I mean, that's the difference of the kind of adrenaline rush and the thrill of being in print and of talking to people who want to read you, who you can help direct them to see this, or demonstrate a kind of example of how you can look at or take apart that was so thrilling. And I realized that lots of times I wouldn't know the most about what I was writing about, but that if I could just try to be honest, which is not easy, that was the most I could do. Up until that point, I had really thought that critics were sort of spokespeople for artists, that you basically stand beside the artist and you it's kind of like sign language. You know, the artist is doing this in their work, and then you're telling people what the artist thinks he or she is doing in their work. So when I wrote an article on Guston, Philip Guston, I really wanted to know that I had pleased Philip Guston. And when I got to The Voice, I just realized that's over, you know, and it was because of the sense of a readership and your sense of the presence of that I wasn't standing beside the artist helping them get their point across. I was basically out in the audience on the first tier of the audience, admittedly, but I was a member of the audience, and all I was doing for artists was telling them how their work was received. So it's the broadcast model is completely turned around. And if I did, an artist could take what I read and say, this is bullshit, I'm never going to read this woman again. Or they could take it and say, this isn't the response I wanted. This isn't what I think my work is about. How can I change my work to make it clearer what it's about? So they could accept it as information, just a reaction to what they thought they were broadcasting, or they could, ignore it. But that was it. That was really the extent of my function for artists. And as I think I've indicated, that was incredibly liberating. I realize that I've just left out a whole introduction to this talk, so we'll go there now. I only give one talk. This is it. I've given it for probably 30 years. And so it's always the same. If you've seen pieces of it on YouTube or whatever, you kind of get the gist. And it's always different, partly because you're going to get involved, and partly because things change. So basically what I do is I give it a new title every so often. I think when I first began, it was like, I, a Critic, and then I titled it for a while, A Life Sentence, and then I decided to crib from Rosalind Krauss's book and talk about criticism in an expanded field, because that's sort of, at my stage, there are several expanded fields that one could talk about. There's the expanded field of the art world, in a way that's become very immense. And there's the expanded field that's happened electronically, where a lot of people are really acting on the idea that everyone is a critic, in their blogs and even in their tweets. And then there's the expansion that happens inside you, which is very peculiar, where you have seen a lot and you get a frightening understanding of how time moves and about how much time is behind you and how much art you've seen. And you deal with the fact that there are all these younger people who are working and doing things, and I think one of the shocks you have to get over really early is that they don't have your memory. They don't have it's what's in your head isn't in their head, and it's not that's just weird at a certain point. If you because people in their own heads, they don't really age, and then you realize you're talking to people who weren't around in the 70s or the 80s, and well, I actually can't remember the 80s that much either, but I know I went through them. So there's this. And then I think your views of opinion and judgment kind of change, but I haven't really cleared that out yet. Sometimes I'm not so interested in judging. I just am like with the art, and I just want people to go see it. And then sometimes I feel very adamant about it. But you do get a sense of the flexibility of judgment and about how you're just always reworking your opinions in a way. Anyway, so I was at The Voice, and it was thrilling, and then I got fired, and that was devastating, although I recommend it, getting fired at least once in your life. I wasn't hip enough. I'd been there for 4 years, and one day somebody called me up and said, "Hey, I hear Gary, Indiana has your job." And I said, "Really? I hadn't heard that." But it was true. And I had a new editor who was a friend of Gary's, and I was given a warning They give you a 6-week warning during which you can correct the problems, which is that I wasn't writing about young enough artists and wasn't hip enough. And then at the end of 6 weeks, they can fire you. So I waited about 3 weeks, and I went in and said to the editor, I'm leaving, and you wouldn't be doing this if I weren't a woman. And he said, no, you just belong at the Times, and so I left in a huff. I was completely insulted. About a year and a half later, the Times started seeming much more interested. Imagine myself there. And I always feel like there was a kind of decontamination period between leaving The Voice and hearing from the Times. But one night in the fall of 1986, the chief critic, John Russell, called me up and said, Michael Brenson, that's another critic there, is having foot surgery. Do you think you could fill in for a week? And I said, yes. Do you think this could happen more than once? So I felt I was fired for being a woman, and in a way I was hired as I don't think a man would have been hired. But anyway, it took. And I spent 5 years being a freelancer. That's kind of trial by fire. You have to kind of fight your way onto staff if you're a critic. Reporters are like infantry people. They get on staff immediately because they have to be ordered here and there, everywhere. Critics have more wiggle room. You have more temperament. You can say, no, I don't think I want to write about that. So they kind of string you along for years. The record is 11 years. Going from the Village Voice to the Times was like going from a guerrilla band to an organized army. There were clear lines of command, clear lines of communication, an incredibly complicated, incredibly fairly strict hierarchy that was observed at most times. People did different things. You know, you were edited. Somebody else, you were edited again. Different people wrote the captions and the headlines. It was all, there was this very strict division of labor. And again, I felt this kind of terror. I thought, wow, I've been given something really big. It's like I've been given a really big gun. I better be careful. And then I would write kind of mildly negative reviews and be not exactly welcomed with open arms, but I would be welcomed at those galleries. And so that was, again, a bit of liberation. I just thought, it doesn't matter. Ink is ink. I can say what I want, and it'll be mostly okay. And that sort of I had frozen up when I first went there, and then I relaxed. The Times is a prison house of language in the best way. It's all about language, and the kind of crux of that imprisonment is the copy desk. And the copy desk, every department has a copy desk, so culture has one, foreign, national news, sports, style. And the copy desks are full of amazing people who are slightly frustrated in what's happened to their careers, but who have all these different, you may have a specialist on cartoons, you have a specialist on opera, you have all these kind of bodies of knowledge sitting there editing you, and often they will help you. And often they'll just straighten you out about language. So the the closeness with which the Times is edited is one of the great things, that you're constantly learning about language in this everyday way, and you're constantly kind of thinking about, like, well, first of all, language is managed, like I said at the time, so there are little kind of fevers that kind of go through the copy desk. Like one time, the copy desk in Culture divided about the meaning of the word burgeoning, and they couldn't figure it out, so finally they just banned it, you know. But at the Times, I get to do different kinds of writing. I get to review shows. I get to write the first words on artists, young artist shows. I get to write some of the last words on artists in terms of obituaries. I write short reviews. I write longer reviews. So the size of writing is incredible. Any questions? Not yet? Didn't mean to shock you that way. I thought, okay. You know, they told me Canadians don't like to ask questions. So.
When you first started, how much were you paid? At the Times.
Oh, I was paid, well, when you were a stringer, you had a kind of loose contract, so you had a weekly obligation. And I was paid, I think, around $600. And at one point, I discovered that all the music critics who were stringers were paid twice as much as me. And also men. But the reason was that music critics had to go and sit through concerts. And so it was, it didn't take me as much time to decide if I was going to review a show or not. Wasn't this so? But that was for, you know, a long review and a group of short reviews, and then you would get paid maybe by the word for obits. Yes.
Have you ever written any reviews that you later regretted?
Well, you know, the way things go into print in a newspaper is by definition a painful activity, unless you're just supremely confident. And I really think that, you know, I try to tell myself self-doubt is a form of intelligence, you know, don't panic. You know, that basically you're always accompanied by this intense doubt, like the writing isn't good enough, this isn't quite what you mean. So it's very hard if you're on a weekly deadline to learn how to get your opinions, have your opinions take shape before deadline. You know, some of your best ideas unfortunately come after deadline. So there's always this process of regret and what you haven't said. And then when it comes out of, when it's in print, you kind of settle into it and accept it. But I haven't reversed a lot of opinions in my life. I think that when you're really sure of opinions, you're sure, and when you're not, you hedge them a bit. And they really, you know, you leave yourself room. So, and again, I don't think there's right or wrong in terms of looking at art. You know, this is just an argument. I'm just trying to be convincing. And it depends on how, so I don't feel like my position is denied by someone else's. Sir.
Say a little bit about critics. Say a little bit about critics' interaction and role with curators.
I don't have much, particularly if they've got a show up that I'm writing about. I mean, a lot of people, you kind of train people as you do this work, you know, and at a certain point people would say, well, the curator's available to walk through the show with you. And I just think that could be the last thing the curator wants, to guide me through a show and then have everything the curator says be in my review. And it's definitely the last thing I want. So that I always look on my own. I know curators in passing because I've been in the art world a lot, and I kibitz with them. But in terms of what they're actually doing, I very rarely will actually talk about a show, either before or after it's happening. It's just, as I was saying to somebody who interviewed me this afternoon, you know, all you have as a critic is a kind of integrity and independence. That's what you have to maintain. And as you go through this activity, you just learn, you sort of set up these borders for what makes you comfortable and what protects your work. So making it so that no curator can say, I took Roberta Smith through this show. You know, I just don't want that. I think I've done it twice. When I'm completely over my head, I might let it happen. But even then, you have to kind of keep away from it. Does that answer your question, or were you talking on a more social level?
No, it wasn't. I really wanted to talk about the role of the curator as well.
Well,
And its relationship to criticism.
well, I think everybody in the art world is a critic. And you just have, you know, everybody in the art world is always functioning critically. Dealers, collectors, Curators, obviously. Artists, obviously. I mean, an artist's job is to be their own harshest critics. You have to be able to completely destroy your work, I think, to really be original. And I just think that curators have a different, I'm interested in putting my opinions into writing in a kind of short form without footnotes and in newspapers. Curators have to have a real, there's some great writing curators, but I think the curator's main job and the way their criticality function is they have a sense of how objects relate to one another in space, or how you can put, if you're not interested in objects, how you put artistic experiences in space and people move through it and see things, the way objects talk to one another. And I don't think sometimes I think these activities are kind of the same, and they're not at all. I could never be a curator. And I don't want to be a collector. I mean, I like things, but owning them having objects isn't the way I possess.
I'm just wondering, you spoke about the transition from writing.
Can't hear you. Can't hear up here, you guys. You really can't.
Hi. You spoke a little bit about the transition from writing for magazines to newspaper and the thrill of that. I'm wondering if you found the transition difficult in terms of having to see something, say, every week that you thought was interesting enough to write about. Do you know what I mean?
Not so much in New York. There's more than you can ever see. And I think I'm really lucky in that, the thing I would say to people who are really working on their work and on what they're going to be doing around art, whatever you do in art, the best schooling for this is simply looking all the time. And analyzing what you're seeing. You look at good art, you look at bad art, you look at indifferent art. You can always get something out of art, no matter what. The quality level, sometimes the lack of quality may get you down, but figuring out why it's lacking is exercising whatever this facility is that you have. And I've just always gotten a lot of energy out of going to galleries. And I've always felt there was, even when the art world was small, I've always felt that there was much too much. And basically you just see certain shows where you just start talking a review. And I do think, to get to that other thing, just the fact that you can do it, and at the beginning of the week and at the end of the week, people can read it, that's a tremendous motivation. Yes?
I have two questions, but I'll ask them, one at a time. The first one is, you talked a little bit at the beginning about the stoppage that can occur at the neck, mm-hmm. and how part of your job is to kind of arrest that stoppage. And I wanted to ask you if you have any kind of loose thoughts about the relationship between language, written language, and that space of looking at something visual. Like, if there is some kind of conduit that occurs between written language and that relationship of looking, or opening up that space at the neck.
Well, I just think if you start looking all the time, we could spend a couple of hours just analyzing every object in this room, critically, about how it works, how much does it contribute to our, what I would call a kind of emotional health. Because every object that is designed by humans affects us and has a visual IQ. Most of the time, the IQs are really, really low. And a lot of what we live with, most of what we live with is not life-enhancing. But if you just sort of decide that everything in your environment sort of has a visual quality that you can analyze and dissect, then I think art becomes less intimidating because it becomes less separate. And I think there's an inclination in people, like Rauschenberg, I think somebody said, images invite a kind of reflexive verbal reaction. You want to put images into words, you want to put words into images. You know, that's one way to look at it. Another way is I could get really strict, and I think, you know, the thing about art, as opposed to almost anything else that you want to write about, is it's very resistant to language. It really doesn't want, it really resists that conversion. It's very, very hard. And your writing or whatever can just seem so deficient in the face of the art. You know, I mean, that's what I live just about every week. It's like, oh God, I'm using that word again. You know?
But there must be some kind of pleasure in that translation, or something. I mean, I'm asking this out of a really, like from a very personal position, but and curious about what your reflection is. But there must be something in that difficulty that is.
Yeah, there are moments where language just comes out of nowhere in your brain, and there's real pleasure about getting something kind of direct, or getting a series of words that you know will make people want to read further, you know, and then you can have a chance to make it better. But yeah, there is definitely that. It's not all bad, and most of it is anticipation. You know, I'm a great procrastinator. If you're not a procrastinator, you are so far ahead on the pleasure front in a way. Yeah, you have to have that. And then there's just the reward at the end, you know. For me, it's being in print. For an artist, I think it's being able to make something or do something and put it out there, you know, and see how people take it.
Yep. My second question was...
that was only one? Okay. This is it.
My second question was about, it's a lighter question. It was about whether or not you've perceived over the years a kind of a changing reaction to negative reception would not be maybe the right word, but a kind of intensely critical reception. If you have experienced, it's something that I feel like in Canada, there's not a lot of negative criticism in that comes out in general, and I'm wondering if you've kind of perceived a change in how intense criticism can be.
That's a pretty complicated question. I don't know that it's, sometimes I think it's changed, partly because of the internet. I feel like there's this whole liking of things. It's kind of naive enthusiasm about things. But, and I don't know if there's less negativity. I try to maintain a certain level of it. I think it's an obligation. There's a lot of art that irritates me, and you have an obligation to show all sides of your sensibility as a critic or as an artist. And yeah, I've had people who stop speaking to me. You know, it's hard you have to have a lot of, like Peter, to quote Sheldall again, or if I haven't, I often do, he said, you have to be able to lose a friend today and still have friends. So you have to have a certain density, a certain concentration of people. And then when you have that, you know that as much as somebody's going to hate it, there are a lot of people who are never going to say anything who totally agree with you. And that would be kind of under the subject of criticism as a valve. Like you're letting off a kind of collective steam. You know, sometimes you hope you're writing things that nobody has thought of, and sometimes you know you're writing things that everybody has thought of and never said. You know, and that it's a real relief. But again, it has to do with the numbers of people. I also think it has to do with being in newspapers, because when you step into a newspaper situation, you're kind of insulated from the art world, in a way. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
You were talking earlier about when you were a younger critic starting out, and I'm wondering how you, when you first started to deal with editors, when you were first starting out, and perhaps editors said to you, go see this show or write about this, and you were like, do I have to? No, really? Do I have to? How did you negotiate kind of that relationship when you were just starting out?
Well, when I was just starting out in art magazines, they tended not to do that. I think they might have done that at Artforum, I can't remember. It's really weird. I can't really remember how things got assigned. I know that the bigger articles I wrote were people, Archfogger, Guston. These are people I wanted to write about. But I've never had much of a problem of having to get out of writing something. Either I've been able to say no, or I've been interested in writing about it. The only time I really felt compromised was when Oliver, I think it was Oliver Eliasson, anyway, somebody who did the waterfalls on the river in the Hudson.
Yeah.
The Times really wanted that covered. And I went and I gave it a kind of positive review, and everybody hated it. And that was to get back to the earlier question, that was probably the one time where I felt like, I should have either had said no, or I should have said, this is not a good thing. But, that comes with, again, with seeing things quickly and.
And how were you able to convince editors to provide coverage to maybe artists that weren't as well known?
Well, the good thing about writing for the Times as opposed to the Voice is that the Times considers you the authority. Most of the editors you're working with know almost nothing about art other than what they learn on the job. And so if they've trusted you to make you a critic, they're going to trust you in your enthusiasms or your lack of enthusiasms. That was a real, I wasn't, it was completely, at the Voice, everybody thought everybody knew everything, so they were always kind of hoping, wanting things differently. But the Times was really good about that. And I also think they probably, I don't know, people go and look at your shows. You kind of know when you're not. Well, I think editors know what kind of credibility you have in the community. I don't quite know how, but once you get to that point, then you're really fine. Once they've gotten used to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to use some of those arguments on some of my editors. Thank you.
Okay, good luck.
I'm interested in this idea of memory because you talk about seeing a show and the excitement of having it have to be in print on the Friday and the gut reaction. But surely there are pieces that you've come back to over the years with this wealth of knowledge that you've accumulated that lets you see a piece differently, maybe, or a show differently. So how do you navigate the immediate present and the gut reaction with this understanding, the larger understanding?
Well, I'll tell you one thing I do is that I never reread my work. In that, if you have a deadline every week, you're always in forward motion, and that's something that I really like. And it's probably, you can explain it in a lot of ways. Like I procrastinate, I need editors. I have doubts about my work. I need to be in a situation where the pressure precludes me having to go back and mull over it.
Mm-hmm. But do you ever want to mull over it? Like, do you want to?
No.
No?
I don't. I mean, it's, writing for a newspaper is like, there's a constant chance for redemption. You're always thinking, well, I may not get it this time, but the next time it'll be better. I mean, it's, everything, what happens when you get a job is if you're lucky, your neurosis fits that job in a certain way. It's what you need in lots of different levels than just professional things. Mm-hmm. So I'm not interested in, I can't imagine ever working on a collection of my work. Mm-hmm. Because I can't bear these books that people put out of collections of their work. I think criticism has an incredibly, at least mine, I think it has a really short shelf life. And the main thing I'm interested in is, like, each Friday, can I write something, is some part of a piece that holds up in a certain way. It's a very immediate involvement with language. And that it's only, it has a short shelf life, and it's going to be read fast. You know, so you don't have a lot of big theories. You want to have a certain kind of beginning that will grab people, and ideally you want to be able to pull them all the way through it. And the way you go back is that you remember what you sort of remember artists.
Yeah,
like
I
I don't
was gonna
know,
ask that.
I can't remember what I've written about Frank Stella, but I've written about him a lot, and I kind of have a sense of his development and his ups and downs, you know. And sometimes, you know, but I almost never. And then when you read it, it doesn't really sound like you. It's kind of can be either like, wow, that's great, or oh my God, you know. So either way, you don't really quite know yourself. Like I didn't know myself when Robert was talking about me, you know.
Yeah. But it is interesting to trace maybe one artist that you've revisited over the years.
Well, the artist's work, yes, but no. That's if anybody else is interested in doing it, they can do it. But I don't know. I would be surprised.
I'm just curious, we keep sort of addressing this theme of the immediacy of criticism and how it's really just relevant right in the present. And I know you've sort of already addressed this, but I just want to twist the question slightly. What role does criticism play if there's sort of just this brief instant that it exists? And are there any, you know, I know you say that you don't really remember a lot of what you wrote, but are there any real standout exhibitions or artists that you reviewed that your criticism sort of helps evolve, perpetuate sort of this longer enduring?
I don't really know. I'm not interested in that.
Okay. Doesn't overlap
I'm not interested in, like, did I affect someone's career? I mean, occasionally you get great feedback, and artists will come up and say that a negative review helped them. That's the best compliment you can get, you know, when an artist will acknowledge that. But I just put it out there. You know, I say what I want to say, to paraphrase Virginia Woolf, and they say what they want to say. And how criticism functions, well, we're all critical. Criticality is a very important thing to have getting through life. And I'm demonstrating, critics demonstrate a kind of discernment. And it's a kind of discernment that you can apply to, you know, I mean, basically I write editorials. You know, I'm supposed to have opinions. And I'm supposed to say, to try to demonstrate that you can think critically about this thing, which also means you can think about that thing. Well, that thing might be out in the world. That thing might be, you know, Obamacare. It's just like trying to activate something in people. You know, besides the love of art, which I think many people suffer from never knowing. You know, I would say that the middle of America suffers from that a lot. Right wing suffers from that a lot. Because art sort of teaches you teaches you about the world and teaches you about the largeness of life. And they have very small lives when you start, all you can do is meddle in other people's, you know. These people can't get married. That woman has to have that baby, you know. You don't have enough to do. So I think all kinds of criticism has, no matter how short term it is. I mean, humor is great criticism.
Thank you.
Sure.
Have you ever disliked something before writing about it, and through writing about it, come to love it?
Well, I wouldn't say love it, but one of the things that's interesting about writing, and I would recommend this to students as well, is you look at something, you think you have nothing to say about it, you don't have an opinion about it, or you think you don't like it. Just describe it in words. Just start out in this very literal way and start talking about how it's made, what you see first, what you see second, what you see third. You'll find that you actually are articulating things that you didn't know you saw. That's one way to get, like, you have a much richer experience than your conscious mind knows. And I've had that happen many times where I'm thinking I don't like something, and then I just start describing it and I think, whoa, you know, there's more going on than I thought. And the writing of it is partly how you get into what's going on. So that's often happened where I've had my opinion be modified to the positive. It's not going to go from like negative to erase, but it's definitely going to be mitigated just by the process. And if you knew what you were going to write, you wouldn't write. That's, writing totally is a process. Criticism totally is a process. Four? Yes.
Hi. On that point of process, I just wondered how much, when you go to see a show, you might have read what the artist's intention was in the exhibit, and how much that impacts what you write on it, the criticism about it, whether you felt they were successful at that, or whether that even affects what you write.
Well, one thing I often say in these talks is artists do not own the meaning of their work. And that I'm really not, often I've read almost nothing. If I've seen the artist, if I've seen other work, then I have some kind of a background. If I'm really intrigued or stumped, I will read the press release, but I really won't do that until after I've looked. I mean, I might have heard people talking about it, but I'm interested in working back toward the artist from the artistic experience, from the experience of the art. I'm not, the artists, I'm not interested in what they say. I'm not interested in what the dealer says. And because the artwork, whatever medium it's in, that is the saying. That's where the artist is speaking. And they may be saying things to you that they have no intention of saying. So sometimes I'm, but only after I've sort of been thinking about it for a while, really. But it just doesn't matter. Either it's really clear, or it's clear to a certain extent, or it's not clear at all, and you kind of know, in each case, you sort of know where you can go with that.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question about the expanded field of the digital and how that's changing the face of criticism. Everyone's a critic, but they also have blogs, and they have lots of followers, including lots of my students, who then pitch my advice against all of the blogs that are spouting different opinions. So I just have a question about how do we negotiate? How are you thinking about criticism as it kind of flourishes?
As it burgeons?
As it burgeons. Exactly.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I just started tweeting about in August, which I will say is the best antidepressant in the world. No. Anyway, it's so, if you're a writer, it's so amazing to have company periodically when you can take a little break. I don't know, it's just, my phone sounds exactly that way. It's my phone? Sorry. It's right in that first pocket, right there, yeah. Sorry, I meant to turn it off. I think it makes it really interesting that there's all this kind of percolating, and I feel that it's going to produce some good critics. But the thing about blogging is that there is an editing. And writing is, when that gentleman was asking earlier about working things out with editors, writing is almost always, unless you're just a genius and you don't care about whether you publish or not, writing is collaborative. And you really have to have people who will read it and say, you don't need this, your tone is bad here, or do you really mean to say this? Do you know what this sounds like? And there isn't enough of that, so you're getting this kind of raw stuff, Some of it's brilliant, and some people who have blogs have been edited and have become their own editors, so that's fine. But, it's a lot of it's a more rudimentary form of writing that's going to fall away, or it's a more solid form of conversation, I mean, I just think a lot of what goes on in the blogs and even in tweeting is like what people used to say to each other on the phone on Saturday morning after spending the night going to openings, or say at bars. It's just another kind of looser conversation, and what you have to get over you have to sort of find your own place in there and your own confidence about the solidity of your work. And you do have to kind of be able to argue against that, against the things that are being used against you. So that's pretty good exercise, I think. But it's just a lot more stuff.
Thanks.
That's it?
That was the phone saying it's time for...
Thank you. Thank you.
Two quick things. Roberta's a woman of her word. She thought she was going to go back and rest. It's been pretty busy for her. And in fact, she went back to the hotel and I think finished 2 pieces that she sent into New York. So, I mean, this is a lesson in the obdurate necessity of writing and how it never, ever stops. So it's very useful for those of us who write to hear someone who writes this well and this often. So I want to thank Roberta for coming here and for giving us a lesson in how the expanded field is one that is obviously going to continue to expand. And I want to remind you in the audience that the studios are still open, and please do go and see the work of artists that, with luck, in the next few years, Roberta may well be writing about. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you next year at the 9th Shenkman.